The idea of conceptual initiation, especially as Joe Bandel frames it in Chapter 14 of the Oak Matrix Unleashed, starts with a pretty startling realization that many of our deepest beliefs are just stories we've inherited, not absolute truths. He argues that by unlocking personal freedom through timeless wisdom, we can actually trigger a profound inner transformation. It's essentially about expanding the mind to escape old limitations, often using tools that have been preserved for centuries by secret societies like the Rosicrucians and the Freemasons.
It's a fascinating lens to look through because Bandel is really demystifying these high-level, almost mystical rituals. He connects them back to a time when they were actually political dynamite. If you go back to the 17th century, the Rosicrucian manifestos, like the Fama Fraternitatis from 1614, were circulating in a Europe that was already fractured by religious wars and the rise of modern science. At that point, questioning the literal truth of the Bible, or suggesting you didn't need a priest to talk to God, wasn't just a philosophical debate, it was heresy. It challenged the Church's total monopoly on spirituality.
And that's where the drama comes in. Since literacy wasn't exactly universal back then, these groups used symbolic plays and rituals to transmit their ideas. Bandel describes it as an emotional journey where you might symbolically die and be reborn. It makes me wonder about the psychological weight of that. It's one thing to read a book about growth, but it's another to act out your own death and resurrection in a dimly lit room with a group of people you trust.
The physical experience of ritual bypasses the logical brain and hits the subconscious. In these initiations, the candidate wasn't just a spectator, they were the protagonist. By acting out these stories, the concepts became visceral. Bandel mentions that these mental boxes we live in, the rigid rules and echo chambers, get stretched during these experiences. And once a mind is stretched by a new idea, it can't ever really return to its original dimensions. It's a permanent shift in how you perceive reality.
One of the most explosive ideas he highlights is this notion of personal divinity, the Christ spirit within. That phrase alone feels like it would have set off alarms for the gatekeepers of the time. The idea that salvation comes from an inner surrender to love and truth rather than external rituals or institutional approval is incredibly empowering. But it also sounds like a recipe for chaos if everyone is just listening to their own voice. How did they balance that individual freedom with any kind of collective harmony?
That brings us to Bandel's core philosophy, duality as a loving embrace. He rejects the idea that duality has to be a conflict or a war, like me versus the world. Instead, he uses the analogy of an oak tree. The roots and the branches are opposites, but they work together to create strength. In the case of personal divinity, the internal spark, that intimate, private connection, is balanced by external ethics and community responsibility. You're listening to your conscience, yes, but that conscience is inherently tied to a sense of brotherhood and truth. It's not doing whatever you want, it's aligning your individual will with a higher, universal moral law.
Speaking of moral law, Bandel brings up the Mark Master Mason degree. Historically, that degree is really interesting because it traces back to operative stonemasons in the Middle Ages. They had these unique marks they'd carve into stones to identify their work for payment and quality control. But when it transitioned into speculative masonry, the philosophical kind we know today, those marks became symbols for personal accountability and integrity. It's the idea that your mark on the world should be something you're proud of, something that contributes to the temple of humanity.
Exactly. And that leads to the concept of universal divinity. Initiates were taught that there's one grand architect of the universe, but known by many names: Allah, Jehovah, the goddess. In a time of intense religious intolerance, this was radical. It was a way to bridge different faiths by focusing on the single source rather than the labels. It promoted empathy and reduced inner conflict because you weren't constantly trying to figure out who was right and who was wrong. You were looking for the common thread.
But what about the more out-there concepts like reincarnation and karma? Bandel notes that these ideas were common in ancient mystery schools like the Orphic or Egyptian mysteries, but were labeled as heathen by the later church. In the text, he frames karma not as punishment, but as a loving cycle. If you have a recurring problem, it's not bad luck, it's a lesson that keeps coming back until you confront it. It shifts the perspective from being a victim of fate to being an active participant in your own evolution.
It turns life into a school, and that's where the symbolic interpretation of sacred texts comes in. Bandel suggests that the world wasn't created in 7 literal days, but in 7 stages of creation, moving from vibration to matter. This actually aligns with scientific theories like evolution, which many of these initiates embraced early on. When you stop reading the Bible or other myths literally, they start to function as maps for psychological and spiritual growth. For example, crossing the Red Sea isn't just a historical event, it's a metaphor for overcoming the massive obstacles in your own life.
It's interesting how he brings this back to everyday life. He's not just talking about joining a secret society, he's talking about how we can initiate ourselves. He suggests things like symbolic reflection, spending time daily visualizing a concept like inner divinity as a seed sprouting, or even just having deep, honest conversations with friends, what he calls initiating each other lovingly. It's about creating your own lodge or support group to foster growth that we can't always achieve alone.
It really democratizes the whole idea of initiation. You don't need a degree or a guru. You just need the openness to let a new idea challenge your current worldview. One of his practical suggestions is to journal about a heresy in your own life, some outdated belief you're holding onto, and then symbolically release it, like by burning the page. It's about taking these abstract, high-concept ideas and turning them into actionable tools for self-empowerment.
It seems like the ultimate goal of all this is what he calls superhuman contentment, not in the sense of having superpowers, but in the sense of regaining total control over your own narrative. By understanding the historical context of these ideas, how they were preserved in secret and why they were seen as such a threat, we can appreciate just how precious this timeless wisdom really is. It's about moving away from being a brainwashed follower and toward becoming a free thinker who can navigate the complexities of duality with grace.
And it all comes back to that oak tree metaphor. You need deep roots in self-trust and integrity to withstand the winds of external pressure, but you also need to branch out and connect with the collective. Bandel's work in the Oak Matrix Unleashed is really about showing that these ancient paths aren't just relics of the past. They're living, breathing tools that can help us break free from our own mental limitations today.
The idea that our mind, once expanded, can never shrink back is a powerful one. It means every small step we take toward understanding these deeper truths is a permanent gain. Whether it's through quiet reflection, symbolic ritual, or just questioning the status quo, we're all capable of our own conceptual initiation.
It's a call to be more intentional about the marks we're leaving on the world and the stories we're telling ourselves. If we can see duality as a loving embrace rather than a constant battle, we start to see opportunities for growth where we used to see only conflict. It's a shift from surviving to truly flourishing.
Joe Bandel really bridges the gap between the esoteric and the practical. By exploring the 5 dimensions of these initiations, the history, the technical breakdown, the cultural impact, the controversies, and the practical examples, he provides a comprehensive roadmap for anyone looking to unlock their own personal freedom. It's about turning the abstract into the actionable.
And it reminds us that even though the world can feel overwhelming and full of toxic brainwashing, as he puts it, we have access to a lineage of wisdom that has weathered much darker times. We're not starting from scratch. We're building on a foundation that's been laid by thinkers, mystics, and craftsmen for centuries.
It's a perspective that offers both hope and a significant amount of responsibility. If you're looking to dive deeper into these concepts and start your own journey of self-empowerment, I'd highly recommend sharing this episode with a friend to start a conversation and see where those new ideas take you.